What's the story with all these vacant properties and derelict sites? People can't understand what's going on there.
No, we're in the middle of possibly one of the deepest housing crises in certainly modern history. And yet, no matter where you go, Dublin city centre, Cork city centre, rural Mayo, rural Roscommon, rural Leitrim, there's just tens of thousands of vacant and derelict homes. If you go into any town or village, particularly over in the western part of the country, over the shop, everything is empty. Right? So on the one hand, we have tens of thousands of people who need social, affordable and private homes. And we have tens of thousands of vacants. The last census told us there was about 150, 160,000 vacant homes, not including holiday homes. And not all of those are in places where people can live or of a quality. But there's another agency called Geodirectories. It's a function of An Post and Talcheran. And they estimate that there's anything up to 80,000 vacant homes and about another 20,000 vacant commercial properties, particularly over the shop. The current government housing plan and the previous one said a lot about this, but they're really doing very, very little. And again, in our housing plan, both on the public housing side, but also as a standalone section, we've set out a bunch of very, very ambitious plans to bring more and more vacant and derelict units back into stock in urban Ireland, in towns and villages, and crucially in rural areas as well.
It's just shocking to see those houses, and we all know them. So what would you do to get them back into use?
So there's three things. So the first thing is on the public housing side, we've a very ambitious programme of social, affordable, rental and affordable purchase. They're not all going to be new builds. First of all, it takes longer and it's more expensive with new builds. And also for the climate, if you're demolishing and building new buildings, it has a very, very big impact on carbon emissions. So we have a very ambitious section of the public housing plan to ensure that every local authority, as they're delivering social and affordable homes, a portion of those homes will be from vacants and derelicts. That means giving the local authorities more money, giving them money up front to buy and refurbish, and setting targets. And that's really, really important. On the private sector side, we also want to see far greater use of vacant and derelict buildings. And therefore, it shouldn't be so easy to demolish. If a building can be reused, we want it to be reused. We also want to make it easier for people who want to buy a vacant and derelict to be able to do that. The government does have a vacant and derelict property refurbishment grant. The problem with that grant, of course, it's paid in arrears. You have to have the money yourself to do the work, and then they pay you afterwards. And we want it to be paid in stage payments as work has been done directly to the contractor. So that means more on the public sector side, but also more on the private sector side for developers and for individuals. And then the third thing is we need to start getting tough with people who are speculatively sitting on vacant and derelict properties. Now, I don't mean a family home where your granny is in fair deal. I don't mean a property that's stuck in probate. I mean folks who are for no good reason sitting on vacant and derelict homes. I've often said speculatively sitting on a vacant home is like hoarding food during a famine. It should not be allowed. And how do you fix it? It's called taxation. There's currently a derelict sites levy of 7% that the local authorities are meant to impose. It doesn't work. We'll transfer it to revenue because we know revenue will go after the money, but also we'll increase by 50% every year. So it'll be 7% year one, but increase by 50% year two, and so on. Very quickly, the owner of that property is going to use it, sell it, or get it into some kind of active use. And likewise, there is a vacant property tax that was introduced by this government, although it only applies to a small number of properties. We'd apply it to all vacant properties, with exemptions for fair deal, probate and some others. But also that would increase by 50% every year. We have to send a signal to people who have homes that people could live in and they're leaving them vacant and derelict for no good use. Either use it yourself, sell it to somebody who will live in it, or sell it to the local authority, and we can use it for public or private homes. It's one of these issues that really frustrates people because, you'll walk up parts of Dublin City and there's teenage couples sleeping in tents in doorways of buildings that are vacant and derelict. In Cork City, whole sections of the city centre are vacant and derelict. So it's about supporting public and private sector actors who want to bring those units back into use, and it's about punishing those people who for no good reason are sitting on vacant and derelict properties when they could be homes for people.
Sure, in Galway, where I live, there are so many of these sites and they're absolute eyesores. They're also actually kind of dangerous because fires and stuff can happen quite easily in them. But you're telling me it's going to be you either use it or you absolutely lose it, and you need to move on.
And Galway's an interesting example because when I was with you there the last time, if you remember, we met some folks from the council who are actually really trying hard to get vacants and derelicts back into use. And the problem at the moment is the Department of Housing. won't give a commitment to the local authority for the refurb costs. Yes, they'll say you can buy the building, but we're not guaranteeing you'll have the money to refurb. Also, whatever money they give, it's in arrears rather upfront. So on the local government side, we have to make it the easiest option possible for a local authority to go in, refurbish, and then use it for social, affordable rental, and affordable purchase. And I think if we make those changes to the funding streams for local authorities and approved housing bodies, they'll respond in kind. There's a wonderful project down in the Keys. It's called Ellis Court. Okay. Ellis Court is right by Croppy's Acre. It's at the back of the Lewis track, so it's bang in the centre of the city. And in the 1880s, 1890s, Dublin Corporation built one of the first public housing projects there. They were kind of red brick, 2, 3, 4-storey, what they called kind of 19th century tenements. They weren't very popular buildings. And then years later, it became a homeless shelter, and then it was derelict. But Dublin City Council and TUA, the not-for-profit housing association, have transformed that into the most exceptional place for people to live. I spoke to one of the elderly tenants who moved from a much poorer quality flat into Ellis Court. It's transformed her life. But crucially, we've kept this beautiful piece of the urban fabric of our city, this really important part of our history. Plus, we didn't have to demolish and rebuild, so the impact of that development on the environment is far, far less. The problem is when you talk to people in DCC and in TUA, they'll tell you it should have been much easier to get that project done. And euro for euro, it's actually more cost effective to do that than demolish and rebuild. Likewise, for folks who want to convert over the shop, it's far too difficult, right? So let's say you're a shop owner, let's say you're running the shop. It takes so much time, effort and money to get the change of use planning permission for over the shop, to get your disability cert exemption, to get your fire cert. For a long time, people have been talking about creating a one-stop shop where the people who either own those buildings or want to buy them can go into a single person in the local authority and get all of their planning permissions and certifications in a timely and cost-effective manner. In our plan, we've committed to introducing that legislation. It's a no-brainer. So again, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, we have to make it the easiest option to bring those vacants and derelicts back into use. And again, I think if we do that, not only will we get lots and lots of really good quality homes, we bring life back into our city and town centres. I was in Athy, and Athy is in South Kildare. It's a depressed housing market. The volume of vacancy and dereliction on their main street was really, really concerning, right? But there's lots of demand for people to have affordable homes to rent or buy, or private homes to buy. So if you went at Athy, if you just said, we're going to fix this main street. Limerick, for example, O'Connell Street is the same, all those beautiful Georgian buildings, but up above the first floor, everything is empty. And likewise, like we really learned this during COVID in our big cities, what happens in a pandemic? All of a sudden we realised there's nobody living in our city centres. There's too much vacancy, too much dereliction. And therefore, if we want to really breathe life back into our cities and not have such a challenge for our cafes and restaurants, etc., we need to make it easier and more cost effective for people to deliver homes in our urban cores, for people to live in those. And therefore, tackling vacancy and dereliction is a really key part of that.
I love that concept with, the small businesses. So like a lot of the small businesses would have something above the shop or that. And they all tell you that it can be so complicated to try and do all these things. And the skill set isn't there. It might be there in a bigger business, but not in a smaller business. So I think that could really breed a bit of life into areas, even into older states where there's still the shops and that.
Yeah, and like, look at where Irish people go for their city breaks, right? We go to Copenhagen, we go to Amsterdam, we go to Berlin, we go to Barcelona, right? And what's the interesting thing about those cities? They're all mid-rise. They're all mixed use. So they have, shops on the ground floor, restaurants, bars. They have schools on the second floor, and then people live on the third, fourth and fifth floors. And that's a really nice way to live because your kids are much safer, walking downstairs and into the school. Your relationship with your local businesses is much more intimate. You can also then see new kind of businesses emerge, like your bakers and your butchers and your, people who actually kind of specialize in those things, which very often means the suppliers of those, goods and services get a much better deal. So the great thing about tackling vacancy and dereliction is, first of all, those buildings are already built. They're already there, right? But also it's a really, really effective way to get people back living in our city centres, our towns and our villages, bring back life, and not just life in terms of people living, but also all of the spin-offs. So for me, it's one of the great failures of the current government housing plan and its predecessor There's a great group down in Cork called Inish, and they've been campaigning around this. They do vacancy and dereliction tours to highlight the scandal of vacancy and dereliction that's now taken off in other places. And therefore, for me, it's one of those areas where for social cohesion, economic development, urban regeneration, and tackling climate change, this is the really, really big one. This is the one where we really need to kind of grasp it and make the change. And again, the types of changes that are required are very straightforward. The problem is there hasn't been the political will to do so. And again, our plan, A Home of Your Own, sets out very clearly, if we were in government, how we would do that.
I think student accommodation just springs to mind as well, because a lot of derelict sites and that are around student, colleges and that, and we're having such a big issue in terms of that. I think that kind of vision to actually tackle this will make such a difference.
And the key there, and of course you know this better than I do because student accommodation is your area of expertise. First of all, we have to provide the capital funding to the universities to provide that not-for-profit student accommodation. We also need to ensure our ITs are able to borrow, something they're currently not able to do. But also it's about just approaching this in a much more planned and coherent way, rather than leaving everything to the private sector. Like I drive, or I get the bus, should I say, up Cork Street regularly on my way to the constituency from the Dáil. And if you go up Cork Street, these huge private student complexes have just mushroomed in nowhere. And we need student accommodation, but the price of that student accommodation is way beyond reach of many students. In fact, it's forcing some students, particularly students from outside of the city, either to turn down student places or to leave or take time out, which obviously impacts on their education. So whether it's student accommodation, whether it's public affordable accommodation for social or affordable homes or private sector accommodation, let's use the built environment we have. Let's use the buildings that we have. Like if you go to Belgium and you go around Brussels, they keep all their buildings. And yes, they do interesting little extensions at the top, or vacancy and dereliction is far less of a blight on those places. We have a couple of good examples here. Castlebar, they've done some really interesting stuff there because they're a great county manager and county architect. In parts of County Cork, again, because of the county manager and the county architect, they've done some really interesting things. Scotland is leading the way in this, so there's lots of examples of how we can do it. So whether it's Ellis Court, whether it's Castlebar, or whether it's learning from other places, let's just take the policies that work and let's implement them. The time for talking about this is long gone. Let's implement it. But that can only happen if we change a government and if Sinn Féin gets a chance to implement our housing plan.
I might just ask one other question, if that's okay. What really annoys people is seeing empty council houses and taking a good bit of time to turn over them into a council house for somebody in the estate. Are you going to be looking at resourcing in that sense?
Absolutely. What's important to know about this is there should always be some council homes that aren't occupied. People move out, people move in, you have emergencies. So the real issue for us at the moment isn't that we have too many council homes empty at any one time. It's they're empty for too long. The National Oversight and Audit Commission publishes a report every year. They show the average turnaround times. It is a scandal. Some local authorities have an average turnaround time of 30, 40, 50 weeks. A couple of problems. Not enough resourcing into the local authorities because some of these might have had somebody living in it since the 1950s and there's a lot of refurb costs, rewiring, new insulation and energy efficiency. The second thing is a lot of our local authorities are now actually using kind of public procurement where they have a framework agreement and they'll bundle a certain number of properties before they'll do the works, and that just takes too much time. And then on top of that, there is a fund available from central government, but it takes too long to get approval for that. So if we were in government, what we would do, we would set average turnaround times of 10 weeks, and therefore local authorities would be required to bring the turnaround time from when a council tenant moves out to when moves in to 10 weeks, and it would be allocated during that time. Will there always be a small number of anomalies at the edges? Yes, but we'd identify those and we'd make sure the local authorities have the resources, because in many cases, while somebody is waiting to go into that vacant property, because it's typically allocated before the work is done, they're either paying huge rent in the private rental sector, so the taxpayer is subsidising that through HAP or RAS, or they're in emergency accommodation and the taxpayer is paying a very heavy price for that. That's before we even talk about the heavy price of the family with children in the emergency accommodation. So it's actually more expensive to leave those homes vacant while people are forced to live in emergency accommodation or HAP and RAS. So the money is there to do this more efficiently, but it's about setting a target, saying 10 weeks should be the average turnaround time, and making sure local authorities have the resources to do it. And if they fail, hold them to account.